My aunt staged a series of falls so I'd withdraw from graduate school and become her live-in helper. I was packing my apartment for the move to Boston when Aunt Diane called saying she'd fallen down the stairs and was in the hospital. My acceptance to the MBA program at Harvard came after 2 years of applications and working garbage jobs to save money. I'd deferred once already to help my parents through financial trouble. This was supposed to be my year. But when I got to the emergency room, Diane was in a neck brace with her ankle wrapped in a cast. The doctor said she'd fractured her fibula and sprained her neck badly. She'd need someone to stay with her for at least 6 weeks during recovery. She lived alone in the house where I'd spent summers as a kid. My mom died when I was 16, and Diane had stepped in when my dad fell apart from grief. She'd paid for my community college tuition when Dad couldn't work. She'd co-signed my first apartment lease. She'd been there every single time I needed family. So when the social worker at the hospital said Diane couldn't be discharged alone, I called Harvard and asked about deferring again. The admissions coordinator's voice was kind but firm. This was my second deferral. One more and they'd have to give my spot away. I told Diane I'd stay for the 6 weeks and then figure something out. She cried and squeezed my hand and said I was the only family she had left who cared. The first week wasn't terrible. I helped her to the bathroom, made her meals, managed her medications. She needed help getting dressed and bathing. It was awkward and exhausting, but I kept telling myself it was temporary. 6 weeks. I could handle 6 weeks. Then I'd hire a home health aide and leave for Boston. Diane's house was paid off, and she had decent retirement savings. She could afford professional care once she was more mobile. But during week 2, she fell again. I was in the kitchen making lunch when I heard the crash from her bedroom. She'd tried to walk to the bathroom alone and collapsed. This time, she hit her head hard enough to need stitches. The doctor said she likely had a concussion, and her recovery timeline just doubled. 12 weeks now, minimum. I sat in the hospital waiting room and felt my Harvard dream slipping further away. I called the admissions office again, and the coordinator's tone had shifted from kind to exasperated. They couldn't hold my spot indefinitely. Other candidates were waiting. I either committed to starting in January, or they'd have to move on. January was 4 months away. Diane would be recovered by then. I told them I'd be there in January, and they made me sign a form acknowledging this was my final extension. Diane apologized constantly when I brought her home from the hospital. She said she felt like such a burden and hated taking me away from my future. I told her it was fine. That family came first. All the things you're supposed to say. But inside I was calculating timelines and costs and trying to figure out how to make this work. I started looking for home health aides in the area. The good ones were booked months out or charged rates Diane said she couldn't afford. The affordable ones had terrible reviews or showed up drunk to interviews. I spent 3 weeks trying to find someone reliable and came up empty. Around week 8, Diane seemed to be improving. She could walk short distances with a walker, and her neck brace was off. I started thinking maybe we'd turned a corner and I could actually leave by December. Then she fell again, this time in the shower while I was grocery shopping. A neighbor heard her screaming and called an ambulance. I got the call while I was in the produce section and my hands went numb. 3rd fall in 2 months. The ER doctor looked at me with concern and asked if we'd done cognitive testing. Falls in elderly patients could indicate neurological issues or early dementia. They wanted to run tests. The tests came back showing some cognitive decline consistent with early Alzheimer's. The neurologist said it was mild now, but would progress unpredictably. Diane might have years of functional independence, or she might decline rapidly. There was no way to know. She'd need supervision increasingly over time. Someone to make sure she took her medications, didn't leave the stove on, didn't wander outside at night. I stood in the hospital hallway reading the diagnosis and felt my future collapsing. I couldn't leave her alone now, not with a degenerative brain disease, but I also couldn't give up Harvard, not after everything I'd sacrificed to get there. I called my dad hoping he'd offer to help. He lived 6 hours away with his new wife and her kids. He listened to me explain the situation and then said he was sorry, but he couldn't take Diane in. His wife had her own aging parents to worry about. He suggested I look into memory care facilities, but those places cost thousands a month, and Diane's savings wouldn't cover it for more than a year. After that, she'd be dependent on Medicaid, and the quality of care would plummet. I knew this because I'd watched my mom's aunt waste away in one of those places. The smell of urine and unwashed bodies, staff that ignored call buttons, residents left in soiled clothes for hours. I couldn't do that to Diane. She'd given me so much when I needed her, but staying meant sacrificing the education and career I'd worked toward for 5 years. I was 28 years old and felt like my life was being stolen week by week. I started resenting every small task, every meal I cooked, every medication reminder, every time she asked me to help her stand or reach something or figure out her television remote that she'd used for 10 years but suddenly couldn't remember how to operate. The resentment made me feel horrible because she wasn't doing this on purpose. She was sick and scared and alone. Harvard called in November asking for my enrollment confirmation. I told them about Diane's diagnosis and asked if I could defer 1 more semester. Complete silence on the other end. Then the coordinator said they'd already been extremely accommodating. They had a wait list of qualified candidates who were ready to commit. If I wasn't enrolling in January, they needed to know now so they could offer my spot to someone else. I asked for 48 hours to decide, and she agreed reluctantly. I spent those 2 days pacing Diane's house and trying to figure out impossible math. Every scenario ended with me losing something critical. Diane found me crying in the kitchen at 2 in the morning. She was confused about where she was and thought we were back in her old apartment from when I was a kid. She asked where my mom was, and I had to explain again that Mom died 12 years ago. She looked shocked each time, like she was hearing it for the first time. The neurologist said this was part of the disease. Short-term memory went first. She'd lose recent events, but remembered decades-old details perfectly. Watching her confusion and fear made my decision feel inevitable. I couldn't abandon her to navigate this alone. I emailed Harvard and withdrew my enrollment completely. The admissions coordinator's response was brief and professional. She wished me well and said if I wanted to reapply in the future, I'd need to submit a completely new application with no guarantee of acceptance. 5 years of work evaporated in one email. I sat at Diane's kitchen table and stared at my laptop screen until the words blurred. That night, I got drunk for the first time in months. Diane shuffled into the living room around midnight asking where her mother was. I told her gently that her mother had been dead for 30 years. She looked at me with such devastation that I started crying again. This disease was going to steal her piece by piece until nothing remained. The next morning, I woke up on the couch with a splitting headache and profound regret about the drinking, but zero regret about my decision. Diane needed me. That was the reality. I'd figure out my career later. Maybe take online courses or get my MBA somewhere local eventually. I called a family meeting with Dad and my 2 older brothers who both lived out of state. I explained Diane's diagnosis and my decision to stay. I asked if anyone could contribute financially so I could hire part-time help and maybe take some classes. Dead silence. Then my oldest brother Garrett said he couldn't spare anything right now. His wife was pregnant with their 3rd kid. My other brother Neil said he was barely making rent in Seattle. Dad said he'd send $500 a month, but that was all he could manage. I did the math. $500 didn't cover even 1 day a week of professional care. I'd be doing this alone. Garrett suggested I move Diane into a facility and use her house sale money to pay for it. I explained that wouldn't last long, and then what? He shrugged and said that was what Medicaid was for. I asked if he'd want me to put him in a Medicaid facility someday, and he got defensive. Said that was different. He'd have his wife and kids to care for him. Diane had made choices that left her alone. That comment made me so angry I hung up on him. I settled into a routine that felt like slowly drowning. Wake up at 6 to help Diane shower and dress. Make breakfast. Give her medications. Do laundry and cleaning. Make lunch. Try to keep her engaged with activities so she didn't decline faster. Make dinner. More medications. Help her to bed. Repeat. Endlessly. I started ordering groceries online because leaving her alone for even an hour felt dangerous. She'd tried to use the stove once while I was gone and nearly started a fire. I installed monitoring cameras so I could check on her from my phone. The house started feeling like a prison where I was both guard and inmate. Money got tight by month 3. Dad's $500 helped but wasn't enough. I burned through my Harvard savings covering household expenses and Diane's medical bills. Her insurance covered some costs but not all. I needed to work but couldn't leave her unattended. I found a remote data entry job that paid garbage wages but let me work flexible hours. I'd type reports at midnight after Diane was asleep, my eyes burning from exhaustion. Some mornings she'd wake me at 4, asking why there were strangers in her room. I'd explain again about the disease, and her fear and confusion would break my heart fresh each time. I stopped answering calls from friends who wanted to know when I was moving to Boston. Eventually, they stopped calling. My girlfriend Ashley broke up with me over text saying she couldn't do long distance anymore. I'd been so consumed with Diane that I hadn't noticed we'd barely spoken in weeks. I felt relieved more than sad. One less person to disappoint or let down. My world had shrunk to Diane's house and the endless cycle of caregiving. I was 29 years old and felt like I'd already lived an entire lifetime of exhaustion. Around month 6, I noticed something strange. Diane's falls always seemed to happen when recovery timelines were approaching their end. Right when I'd start researching caregiving services or talking about my future plans, she'd have another accident. I told myself I was being paranoid and unfair. She had a disease. Falls were part of the progression, but the pattern nagged at me. The first fall happened the week I was supposed to leave for Harvard. The second fall happened when I started looking at January enrollment. The third fall happened right after I'd found a promising home health aide. Coincidence. Had to be. But then I found the notebook. I was looking for her insurance cards in her bedroom dresser and found a spiral notebook shoved in the back under some sweaters. The first few pages were normal, grocery lists and medication reminders. Then I flipped to a page dated 2 months before her first fall. It said, "My nephew leaves for Boston in September. He's all I have left." Then more entries. I need to show him how much he's needed here. Cannot manage alone. More entries describing her fear of being alone and abandoned. Then, an entry dated the day before her first fall. Tomorrow morning, before he finishes packing. The stairs will work. My hands started shaking as I read. The second fall was documented too. Bathroom during his grocery run. Timed it carefully. He'll come back. The third fall. Shower accident. Neighbor will hear. I sat on her bedroom floor with that notebook feeling like reality had shattered. She'd been faking. All of it. The falls were staged. The injuries were real but self-inflicted. She'd thrown herself down the stairs and smashed her own head against the bathtub deliberately. To trap me here. To make me give up Harvard. To ensure I'd never leave. The Alzheimer's diagnosis was the only thing I couldn't figure out until I flipped more pages. Research on early dementia symptoms was written out in her handwriting. Memory problems easy to fake. Confusion about time and place. Difficulty with familiar tasks. She'd studied the disease and performed it perfectly. The neurologist had diagnosed her based on behaviors she'd deliberately mimicked, and a cognitive test she'd intentionally failed. I felt sick, physically sick. I ran to the bathroom and threw up everything in my stomach. Then I went back and read the entire notebook. Page after page of manipulation documented in her own handwriting. She'd planned this for months, researched exactly how to trap me, knew I'd never abandon family, especially after what she'd done for me. She'd weaponized my gratitude. I found her in the living room watching television. She looked up at me with that sweet, confused expression she'd perfected. "Oh, sweetheart, I didn't hear you come in. Have you been here long?" I held up the notebook. "How long were you planning to keep this going?" Her expression didn't change for 5 seconds. Then, like watching a mask fall away, her face transformed. The confusion disappeared. Her eyes went sharp and clear. She looked at me with full awareness and something close to defiance. "You weren't supposed to find that." Her voice was different, too. Stronger. No tremor or hesitation. "Were you ever actually sick?" I asked. My voice sounded strange and distant. She stood up from her chair without her walker, moved with perfect balance. The fractures were real. I had to commit to it. "But the Alzheimer's? I've been acting." She said it casually, like admitting she'd been faking a food allergy. "I watched videos online, read medical journals, practiced the symptoms." She sat back down and looked at me with something that might have been guilt or might have been annoyance at being caught. "I know you're angry, but try to understand. I'm 68 years old. I don't have anyone else. Your father abandoned me. Your brothers never call. You're all I have left. So you destroyed my future?" The anger was building now, hot and consuming. "You made me give up Harvard. You've kept me prisoner here for 6 months based on lies?" She shook her head. "I gave you a home. I paid for your education when you needed it. I was there when your mother died and your father couldn't function. You owed me." The entitlement in her voice made me want to scream. "I didn't owe you my entire life." She stood up again and walked toward me with perfect mobility. "What life? Working some corporate job where you're just another number? I gave you purpose. Taking care of family is noble. It's meaningful. You're insane." The words came out quiet, but she flinched like I'd shouted. "I'm practical. I knew you'd leave if I didn't give you a reason to stay, so I created reasons." She gestured around the room. "And it worked. You're still here. You chose to stay because deep down you knew it was right." I backed toward the door, needing distance from her. "I chose to stay because I thought you were dying. That's not the same thing." She followed me. "But you're still here. That's what matters. We can move past this. I'll stop pretending to be sick. We'll take care of each other. It'll be better now that there's no secrets." I left the house without another word, got in my car, and drove with no destination. I ended up at a park where I used to play as a kid and sat on a bench trying to process what had just happened. 6 months of my life stolen through calculated manipulation. Harvard gone. My savings gone. My relationship gone. My future completely derailed because my aunt had decided she owned me. I pulled out my phone and called my dad. When he answered, I told him everything. The notebook, the staged falls, the fake Alzheimer's. He listened in silence. Then he said, "That's definitely something Diane would do." "You knew she was capable of this?" My voice rose. "Why didn't you warn me?" He sighed. "She pulled similar things with your mom. Manufactured emergencies right before important events. Your mom's wedding, both your older brother's births. Always needed something right when the attention was elsewhere. Your mom called it Diane's drama tax. We just learned to work around it." I wanted to reach through the phone and shake him. "And you didn't think to mention this when I told you I was staying to help her?" He had the decency to sound uncomfortable. "I thought maybe she'd grown out of it. And honestly, I thought you'd figure it out faster." I hung up on him and sat watching kids play on the swings. I needed to decide what to do next. I could go back and confront Diane more directly. I could pack my things and leave. I could call Adult Protective Services and report her false medical claims. Every option felt wrong. I was so angry I couldn't think straight. My phone rang. It was Diane. I ignored it. She called 4 more times. Then she texted, "Please come home. We need to talk about this rationally. I'm sorry you're hurt, but you're overreacting." The audacity of that message made me laugh. Dark, bitter laughter that made other people in the park stare. I drove to my friend Keith's apartment across town. We'd been roommates before I moved to take care of Diane. He opened the door, took one look at my face, and let me in without questions. I told him everything while we sat on his couch drinking beer. When I finished, he just said, "What do you need?" Not judgment, not advice, just that question. I said, I need to figure out if she committed any actual crimes, if I can get her charged with something. Keith pulled out his laptop and we started researching. Fraud, elder abuse statutes applied to faking illness, false medical claims, insurance fraud if she'd billed anything. The more we researched, the more complicated it got. Diane had been careful. She'd genuinely injured herself with the falls, so the medical treatment was legitimate. She'd failed cognitive tests voluntarily, which wasn't illegal. She hadn't billed insurance for anything fraudulent. She'd manipulated me emotionally and psychologically, but that wasn't technically criminal. I could maybe pursue a civil case for financial damages, but that would take years, and money I didn't have. Keith looked at me seriously. Forget legal revenge? What do you actually want? I thought about it. I want my life back. I want her to face consequences. I want everyone to know what she did. Then document everything and leave. Take photos of that notebook. Get your own place. Let her figure out her own care. And when family asks why you abandoned her, you show them the proof. It was good advice. I went back to Diane's house late that night when I knew she'd be asleep, let myself in quietly, and went straight to her bedroom. The notebook was exactly where I'd left it. I photographed every single page with my phone. Then I went through her dresser systematically, found more notebooks, years of them, documenting manipulations I'd never known about, times she'd faked emergencies to get my mom's attention, times she'd lied about finances to get money from Dad, a whole pattern of behavior spanning decades. I found medical bills from a psychiatrist dated 5 years ago, diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder, treatment recommended. She'd gone to 3 sessions and quit. The psychiatrist's notes said patient shows no genuine insight into how her behavior affects others. Prognosis poor, without sustained treatment. I photographed all of it, built a complete case file of her manipulation. Then I packed my things while she slept, filled my car with the belongings I'd brought 6 months ago, moved quietly because I didn't want to face her, left her a note on the kitchen table. I found everything, all the notebooks, all the lies. I'm leaving. Don't contact me. I'll be sending the family documentation of what you did. I drove back to Keith's and crashed on his couch, slept for 12 hours straight. When I woke up, Diane had called 30 times and left 20 voicemails. I listened to them in chronological order. The first few were angry. How dare I leave her alone? She'd call the police and report me for elderly abuse. The middle ones were bargaining. She'd go to therapy. She'd change. We could work through this. The final ones were desperate. She was sorry. She'd made terrible mistakes. Please, just come back and talk. I saved all the voicemails as more evidence. Then I blocked her number. I sent an email to Dad and my brothers with all the photos attached. Explained what had happened and why I was done. Garrett responded first. Said he'd always thought Diane was unstable but figured it wasn't his problem. Neil said he was sorry I'd gone through that, but he still couldn't help financially. Dad called instead of emailing. He apologized for not warning me adequately about Diane's patterns. Said he'd tried to keep her at arm's length for years because she was exhausting. I asked why he'd let me walk into this trap knowing what he knew. He didn't have a good answer. Just more apologies that felt hollow. I started rebuilding systematically. Found a studio apartment I could barely afford. Got a better remote job through a contact Keith connected me with. Started therapy to process everything that had happened. My therapist said Diane's behavior fit classic narcissistic abuse patterns. She'd identified me as her primary source of attention and validation. When I tried to leave for Harvard, she'd manufactured a crisis to pull me back. The staged falls and fake Alzheimer's were just escalations of a lifelong pattern. Understanding the psychology helped, but didn't stop the anger. The anger was consuming. I'd wake up at night furious about the 6 months she'd stolen, the Harvard acceptance I'd never get back, the career trajectory I'd lost, the relationship that ended, the friendships that faded. All of it sacrificed because I'd believed her lies. My therapist said anger was part of grieving. I was grieving the future I'd planned and the family I thought I had. The aunt who'd helped me after Mom died turned out to be just another manipulator, waiting for a chance to exploit my gratitude. Everything good she'd ever done was revealed as investment toward future control. Diane showed up at my apartment 3 weeks after I left. I watched her through the peephole. She looked genuinely distressed, hair uncombed, clothes wrinkled. She knocked and called my name. Please, I just want to talk. 5 minutes. I need to explain. I didn't answer. She stood there for 10 minutes before leaving. She came back twice more that week. The third time I called the police and filed for a restraining order. Showed them the notebooks and voicemails. The officer taking the report looked disturbed. This is calculated stalking disguised as family concern. The restraining order was granted within 48 hours. My therapist helped me craft a response for when family asked about the situation. I wouldn't justify or over-explain. Just, Diane systematically manipulated me through faked medical emergencies. I have documentation. I've moved on. Most people didn't push further. A few relatives didn't believe me. Thought I was being cruel to an elderly woman who needed help. I showed them the notebook photos. Their expressions changed instantly. One cousin said she'd always felt uncomfortable around Diane but couldn't articulate why. Now it made sense. Several family members reached out to share their own stories of Diane's manipulation. Turned out she'd pulled variations of this on multiple people over decades. I tried contacting Harvard in a desperate long shot, explained what had happened, and asked if there was any possibility of reconsidering my enrollment. The admissions coordinator was sympathetic, but firm. They'd filled my spot. I could reapply, but would compete with the general applicant pool. No special consideration. I thanked her and hung up, feeling that door close permanently. That hurt worse than almost anything. Knowing the opportunity was truly gone. I'd worked so hard for that acceptance. Deferred once for legitimate reasons. Lost it the second time because I'd trusted family. I applied to other MBA programs. Local schools that weren't Harvard but would still advance my career. Got accepted to a solid state university program starting in January. It wasn't the prestige I'd wanted, but it was progress. The anger started shifting to determination. Diane had stolen 6 months, but she wouldn't steal the rest of my life. I'd get my MBA somewhere else, build the career I wanted, succeed despite her sabotage. That became my focus, converting anger into fuel for moving forward. My therapist said that was healthy as long as I also processed the emotional trauma. I was doing both, crying in therapy sessions and crushing job applications the next day. Word spread through the family about what Diane had done. People who'd defended her went silent. She'd burned every bridge. My dad called to say she'd contacted him asking for money. He'd refused, and she'd gotten nasty. Brought up every grievance from their childhood. Blamed him for ruining her life. Classic narcissist pattern of everyone else is the problem. He said she sounded desperate and isolated. I felt nothing. No pity, no satisfaction, just nothing. She'd made her choices and now faced consequences. That was justice, even if the legal system hadn't delivered it. I started my MBA program in January and threw myself into the coursework. Made new friends who knew nothing about Diane or what I'd been through. Built a life that was completely separate from that chapter. Graduated 2 years later with honors. Got recruited by a firm that valued my determination and work ethic. Started earning enough to rebuild my savings and plan for actual stability. None of it erased what Diane had done, but it proved she hadn't broken me. I survived her manipulation and built something good anyway. 5 years after leaving her house, I got a call from a social worker saying Diane had been hospitalized. She'd listed me as emergency contact years ago and nobody had updated the paperwork. She'd actually fallen this time. For real. Broken her hip. Was asking for me. The social worker said she seemed confused and scared. Possibly real dementia now. I listened to all of this and felt absolutely nothing. I told the social worker to contact my father or brothers. I was not involved in Diane's care. She asked if I was sure, mentioned that Diane seemed to have no one else. I said that was her own doing and ended the call. My therapist said that boundary was healthy. I'd protected myself from being pulled back into her manipulation. Some relationships couldn't be repaired. Some people didn't deserve second chances. Diane was both. Thanks for watching till the end.